I gotta tell my kids behavior class. Like,
Right.
teacher comes in.
Yeah, I think that's all great.
Yeah.
Check it on my phone,
Yeah.
make sure it's working solid for
The
everyone.
interruptions and sarcasm, tone it down just a little bit.
Not today.
Very special.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we're good. It's live. Okay.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kayla Duncan, and I am the current Vice President of the African American Coalition. And I would like to welcome everybody to the second annual Cultural Conversations. This will be our second session that we're having today. And we're going to have Dr. Titanski-Hooper and Dr. Dillon Tatum come to us and talk about their specialties and how that relates to our cultural conversations. And so, little housekeeping, if you signed up for CEUs, you will receive a link from me by the end of today with the quiz for today's CEUs and go from there. And then you'll receive your certificate in an email. Also, if you have any questions online, there's a moderator that is moderating the information, and we'll call your question out at the end when we do Q&A. If you have any questions inside of here, you can just raise your hand and the speakers will call on you. And I hope that everybody enjoys the talk that Dr. Titanski-Hooper and Dr. Dillon Tatum are going to give to you. So we're going to bring them up and have them start. Thank you so much, Dillon. Thank you guys all for being here today. Can everybody hear me okay? Awesome. All right. Dr. Tatum and I are really excited to be here to talk to you about the relationship between democracy and public space. And we come from the same department here at FMU, but very different disciplines. I'm a geographer that studies how political and cultural processes influence and are influenced by spaces, places, and landscapes. Dr. Tatum is a political scientist and international relations scholar who examines how political thought can impact the formation and function of our political institutions and processes. So today we're joining forces to discuss how all of these ideas help us to have a better understanding of the importance and limitations of public spaces in our democracy. As we see it, public spaces have taken on renewed importance in recent years for a couple of reasons. Firstly, COVID-19 has hindered our ability to use public spaces and to actually be out in public for air safety concerns. Secondly, there's been a longer-term process by which our public spaces have become privatized, and we've seen them disappear from our communities and all of the resources that they provide us. And thirdly, access to public space is a key factor in understanding issues related to access to voting rights and democratic participation more broadly. We're going to take a look at these issues today as they play out in some historical and contemporary examples of how our public spaces are bordered across race, gender, and class lines. Dr. Tatum's going to start us off with an introduction to the relationship between public space and democracy.
Right. Thank you, everybody. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these important terms that we're going to get into today when it comes to issues of public space and its relationship to democracy. I want to start by defining some of these terms and providing a through point for thinking about the connection between democracy and public space. So firstly, the term democracy itself is a term that comes from Greek. It comes from two Greek words. One is demos, which refers to the people or the citizenry, and in the ancient Greek context, demos really referred to the citizenry of the ancient Greeks. And kratos, the second word, means rule by. Democracy, when we shove these words together here, we get rule by the people or the citizenry. It's the practice of self-rule. Now this painting on the right here is a painting, an artist's rendering of Pericles' funeral oration. Pericles was the leader of Athens in the 5th century BC during the Peloponnesian War. And Pericles' funeral oration, the speech itself, was all about the importance of democracy in constituting ancient Athens. And really kind of relevant to what we're talking about today in public space, because the funeral oration itself as a Greek institution was this speech given by leaders after the war dead had come home to be collectively buried. And so it's using these public spaces to sort of democracy. The next term is public. The term public in the context of politics typically refers to one of two things. One, the citizenry as a whole. The public is the realm of the citizen, and it represents the political community as a collective. And as an adjective, public means of or relating to the common interest. The public realm is one that focuses on the needs of the community as a whole. And then finally, another key concept here is the concept of space. All sorts of different potential meanings having to do with geographies of being and living. The term space is best given its proper sociality by philosopher Michel Foucault, who argues that space is, quote, the form of relations among sites. Space is therefore a concept about relating sites together. So democracy is about citizen rule. Public refers to common interests, the citizenry as a whole, and space are those forms of relations among those physical sites of citizenship. So how do these concepts, democracy, the public, and space, interact with each other? Well, first of all, we can talk about, and we will talk about in this lecture, about public spaces, relations between sites of citizenship and public concern. And we'll give you a pretty good amount of examples of these public spaces and their importance in politics and more. Second, democracy is deeply related to public space. It's really the topic of this talk. It refers to the ways in which citizens interact with sites of citizen relationship and how we rule each other through those sites. And a great example of this interaction between democracy and public space is the Occupy Wall Street protests. Does anybody remember the Occupy Wall Street protests? So I'm used to teaching 18-year-olds, and they're like, what was that? I was like 8 years old or whatever. But Occupy Wall Street was a movement that really got off the ground in 2011 and represented a protest against financial interests in the US, and eventually these movements spread abroad. The name Occupy itself signifies how the movement imagined itself as deeply related to sites of citizenship, particularly in the physical occupation of public areas like parks. And so Occupy Wall Street, for instance, very famously was a park in New York City, Zuccotti Park, which interestingly I learned that the protesters were officially forced out of that park exactly 10 years ago this week, November 15th, 2011. The protesters. But nonetheless, they occupied that park in New York City for that protest for 3 months. It illustrates how citizenship and a radically democratic political movement became intertwined with conceptions of space and situatedness. Say, you can't walk through Wall Street without seeing us, without seeing our signs, without seeing us say, we are the 99%, etc. So why do public spaces matter so much for democracy? Well, it's the publicness of the space that matters so much here. German political thinker Hannah Arendt pointed out in her famous book, The Human Condition, that everything that appears in public in that realm of citizenship can be seen and heard by everybody. Public spaces, these relations between sites of citizenship, are arenas of equal knowledge and access among the community. The great thing about public spaces as they relate to self-rule by communities is that they're spaces where, regardless of all of our inequalities that we have, they are spaces of equal knowledge and access. The public, therefore, in many ways, is the world of appearances that constitutes democratic politics in the first place. Democracy cannot exist or function in the private realm, right? Democracy is something that requires public space. And therefore, we can say democracy is not just about voting. I try to get this across to my introductory students all the time. Democracy is not just about going to the polls and casting a vote. It's not about electoral processes. It's about, as philosopher Bonnie Honig writes, the public things that citizens use, that we care for, and are gathered up by. And you'll notice on the slide, I give two examples of this focus on public things and democracy here. One is some of these protests and discussions in 2020 about the Postal Service. There was all these debates about defunding the Postal Service, especially during a year where with COVID-19, there was much more renewed attention to mail-in ballots and mail-in voting, and what defunding or limiting the resources of the Postal Service might do. People like this woman who's protesting here with her son to save the post office is really indicative of this desire to save public spaces and public things, those things that we invest in, use, care for, and are gathered up by. On the other hand, on a much larger scale, we have a picture here of the Million Women's March in 2017 that took place right after the inauguration of Donald Trump. The largest single-day protest in American history. Across the country, 3 million people participated in this protest. And what you notice from this picture here of the march in front of the U.S. Capitol building is the way that these protesters are gathering around a public space, a very visible public space, the U.S. Capitol building, in order to protest and in order to make their claims and their demands clear. And a couple of other examples of public spaces, perhaps some that we're more familiar with than even the Capitol building or post offices in Florence. I think we have one or two operating post offices at this point. But universities are public spaces, right? These are spaces where both inside and outside of the classroom, we gather together and are gathered up by this public institution that allows us to discuss big issues of our time. Richard Schusterman, a philosopher, calls universities small communities in a sense, right? These public spaces gather us up and engage us in public conversation. Things like public libraries too. I always like to talk about the Florence County Library just because it's such a beautiful building, but also public libraries gather us together as well, right? They're these public spaces of democratic engagement that are, as with many public spaces we'll see in a minute, under threat and liable to capture and unequal access. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Titanski-Hooper now, who will talk a little bit about those barriers.
Thank you. So when we consider how important public spaces are to democratic process, we have to consider the ideal of what that space is supposed to offer, and then the kind of practicality of how they actually function, right? So I'm going to start really practically and then kind of move more into that critical discussion of how these spaces actually get used. When it comes to public spaces, we want to think about whether or not they feel accessible to us, welcoming to us. And very practical things like the design and management of those spaces can make them feel more inclusive and democratic or more exclusionary. Public spaces can be physical spaces where people tend to gather, like parks or city squares. They can also be institutions, like Dr. Tatum said, like FNU. We often rely on our public libraries, our schools, our religious institutions for services, as well as places to meet, to debate, and to discuss issues that are important to our communities. A shared feature of these kinds of gathering spaces and institutions is that they are often truly public. And that means they are often funded in whole or in part through public funds, right, or they're nonprofit. In that sense, at least, these are important spaces that are constructed by the people and for the people. However, as we'll discuss here throughout the talk, there are limitations to this. Even those spaces that aspire to be accessible to most people, there are always members of the community that are excluded. There are also other spaces that we often consider to be important gathering spaces that don't meet these traditional definitions of being public. Historically, private businesses like barbershops, restaurants, bowling alleys, or bars have acted as community gathering spaces. And so even when they have private owners who can dictate who is allowed or what is allowed in those spaces, they do form these important touchstones to the community. Increasingly, spaces. And recent controversies over social media have shown how virtual spaces can be important as sites of connection, of democratic contestation, but they're often as destructive as they are helpful. Each of these spaces functions as a public space for democratic process and can be designed in ways that make them more or less accessible. So we're going to take a look at some of the key factors that make a really good public space. This infographic here is from the Project for Public Spaces, an organization that is interested in advancing the use of public space and the design of them that makes them more accessible. And here they highlight the characteristics and features that make some public spaces more functional and inclusive than others. The key to making a great public space is that it has to offer activities that people want to participate in, whether that's picnicking or biking or holding community events. Those activities are, again, often the prerogative of whoever owns them. So again, we see the importance of ownership being by the public and in terms of making this a more inclusive space. Accessibility in general is also another important feature. The space has to be welcoming, but it also has to be functional and that it's easy to access. It's easy to enter, it's easy to use, and then it's ultimately easy to leave. Related to accessibility and activities are issues of whether a space is safe, and we'll discuss that a bit more later on because safety is often based as much in perceptions of safety as it is in reality, and how the infrastructure of the space is ultimately designed. So are there benches, tables and chairs, playgrounds, lighting? In other words, does this space make you and the rest of your community feel welcome? As I said, all of this is really very practical, and it doesn't necessarily tell us a whole lot about how public space relates to democracy. So to further explain that, I want to introduce you to a set of terms that you've already seen on these slides a couple of times that geographers like to use, and that's this concept of bordering. I'm going to start really broad with bordering, and then I'll move to applying it to public spaces. So geographers like myself aren't just interested in how a space looks or how it's designed. We're interested in how a space actually gets used and how people feel about particular spaces. This term bordering can help us to do that. And bordering with parentheses is actually referring to two related processes. Borders, right? Spaces have borders, and these can be built borders, whether they're walls or fences. They can also be natural. Things like rivers and mountain ranges have historically made pretty good borders between communities of people. And they can also be perceived, borders that we actually can't find physically on the landscape, but we sort of know that they are there, the parts of our community where we feel more welcome or less welcome. And those borders are enforced and practiced through a set of orders. Orders refer to the rules, the laws, or the expectations that happen within a space. Virtually every space or place you can think of is bordered or ordered in some way. When I teach this concept to my students, I always give them the example that if you attend church and you were a little kid, you knew very quickly if you were acting outside of the orders of that space. You got a hard look, right? Or a slap on the wrist, and you knew it was time to straighten up and be quiet, right? You were violating the orders of the borders in which you found yourself, right? And so we interact with these kind of relations all of the time. There are even borders and orders in this room, right? What you can expect is acceptable when you attend a public talk. So what's important to geographers is not just what the borders and orders of the space are, but what the implications of those borders are. For example, borders and orders can be based on perceptions. The map that I include here on the slide is a map of the United States and our perceived definition of where the regions are. It's really hard to kind of enforce these regions. There's not a real physical wall that separates, the Northeast from the American South. But our conceptions of where the South begins and ends often relate to our broader borders and orders of who we think of as part of a community or not part of a community, right? So in this way, these borders and orders are quite perceived and yet still powerful. Other borders can seem harmless, but then end up having significant economic, social, or political consequences. The image there on the far left of the Kentucky-Ohio state line is just in the middle of the bridge. You can kind of see where the two states divide. But historically, Kentucky has had full control over the Ohio River. And this goes back to kind of colonial era territorial maps and how they were drawn, but ultimately ended up deployed in the era of slavery. Ohio was a free state, Kentucky was not. And because Kentucky owned the river, they were able to use slave labor to transport goods across the river and then ultimately up into the state line. So while Ohio could profess to be a free state, it very much benefited from those larger systems of slavery and racism just by virtue of where this border was drawn and the labor that was able to be used to function on it. Other borders and orders can also be broken down, destroyed, and have lines crossed. Here at the image of the Berlin Wall, right? Just breaking down a physical wall, but the borders and orders associated between an East and a West Germany. Bordering and ordering then is a very useful framework for understanding our relationship between public spaces and democracy. Does a public space feel welcoming and accessible? And do the borders and orders of a public space make it a site for healthy democratic debate, even if that debate is about resistance, transgression, or the breaking down of borders and orders? Next, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how borders and orders can create or limit democracy in public spaces. For sort of the ideal example, here we have the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The National Mall is an important site for recreation, as well as for the construction of an American national identity, as well as memory and resistance. In its design, the space is meant to be both symbolic and functional. So on the far left, I include just a small kind of inset map. It's very functional in that it is designed to create a pedestrian zone, like you see in the second image, a place where people are supposed to gather and feel comfortable in gathering, right? Here you have people picnicking, and this was from an article about how people were using the National Mall during COVID. Let's get together, but in this open, safer space. The mall is also meant to be somewhat symbolic. The choice of using the white marble to design buildings like the Capitol or the White House was a deliberate connection to those democracies of the ancient world, and particularly Greece, right? We wanted our buildings in the United States to kind of elicit that image of some of the world's first democracies. And the other kinds of buildings and monuments that are located along the mall are also trying to kind of create this memory of what it means to be American, the Smithsonian Museums, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument. So in all of these ways, the National Mall is trying to be that ideal public space, creating a space for community gathering, creating memory, symbolic and functional. But the mall has also been used to challenge existing borders and orders around the nation of the United States. For example, in 1939, Marian Anderson, pictured here, a famous opera singer, was supposed to sing at Constitution Hall, Easter Sunday, no less. Now, Constitution Hall is one of those places that often gets perceived as a more public space. It even has the name Constitution in it. But actually, the space is owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution. And at the time, the Daughters of the American Revolution prohibited her from singing there, citing a whites-only policy, a geographic order, if you will, of that space. Rather than cancel the performance altogether, Marian Anderson was given the opportunity to sing at the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall, and to an integrated crowd of 75,000 people. Certainly a landmark event at a time when Jim Crow laws were prevalent throughout the South and the civil rights movement was more than a decade away. Her performance transgressed the racial norms and the borders and orders of that time, and the National Mall acted as a space where that could happen. The mall is also a space for outright resistance, whether it's the 1963 March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gave the famous I Have a Dream speech, or similarly, the 2020 March for Black Lives Matter, strategically occurring on the same day as the original 1963 march. The borders and orders of the National Mall are designed to support democratic process no matter how painful. That being said, the mall is not without its own borders and orders. Protests must have permits. And the monuments and the museums along the mall have their own rules to protect their condition and to establish their care. Even the subjects of the Smithsonian museums show the subconscious or invisible borders and orders of the American nation. with the Native American and African American museums only opening in 2004 and 2016 respectively. And this reflects that longer struggle for both Native American and African American populations to be considered as equals in American society and to have their stories told. More recently, the limits to the publicness of the mall were challenged with the January 6th riots. The Capitol building may be the people's house, but the violence and destruction of that day did more than transgress borders and orders of the Capitol. It violated the ideals of the mall as a space for peaceful discussion and debate. While the mall is a more traditional public space, in recent years we've seen our understandings of public space switch to the virtual realm. And increasingly, online games like World of Warcraft, which I'll explain this image in a moment, and social media platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook operate very much like the public spaces that we so crave or need in our democracy. So anyone with an internet connection and a subscription can post, network, interact with other subscribers. But these spaces are also rife with orders and orders. For one, all interactions on these sites must meet community standards that are set not by democratic processes or institutions, but by the private corporations that own these sites. Private ownership and public space contradict, as we've already hinted at, because while the goal of public space should be to provide accessibility, the goal of private enterprise is to make a profit. Certainly, we've seen in our recent elections that these virtual spaces have contributed to significant social division rather than democratic interaction. And that's in great part due to how these sites actually work. Facebook uses algorithms which increase the likelihood that the most contentious and divisive posts appear more frequently than others. Virtual spaces then profit from social division, perhaps more than they actually contribute to democratic process. I think we're all pretty familiar with that issue by now. But for a less talked about example, I include this screenshot from the game World of Warcraft. And what you see here is an in-game protest organized by players. The company that created and manages World of Warcraft is Blizzard Activision, a huge gaming corporation. They've recently come under significant fire within their company as well as outside for allegations of abuse and sexual harassment of their women employees. And these are some pretty crazy allegations if you've read about this at all. And they've received criticism not just for the actions that took place, but by their seeming willfulness against actually changing their corporate culture. So their players and subscribers hosted in-game protests like the one that you see here in an attempt to challenge the company to hold itself accountable. This game very much functioning like a public space, right? We're coming to this virtual realm to hold a protest that would look very similar if it was happening in the real world. However, there's an ultimate contradiction here. To play World of Warcraft, you must be a paying subscriber. You're paying Blizzard Activision to protest Blizzard Activision. And therein we see the major contradiction between these virtual privately owned spaces and the ideal of what a public space is supposed to be able to offer us. Both the National Mall and the virtual spaces we interact with offer great examples of how borders and orders work together to promote and or restrict democracy in these spaces that we tend to feel are public. Next, we want to take you through some ways that all kinds of public spaces that we view as integral to democratic processes also inherently create borders and orders surrounding the identities of race, class, and gender. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Tatum for a moment.
Yeah, so as Dr. Titanski-Hooper was talking about, well, public spaces are ideally spaces of equal access and democratic participation. There are many ways that social inequality has led to unequal access in public spaces. And race and racism has played an enormous role here. Spaces in the US have historically been designed to border and order people by race. So Dr. Titanski-Hooper has already given us a couple of examples of this. But one of the big examples we can think of in this regard is Jim Crow laws, which since the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s, all the way up until the 1960s, local and state governments passed laws that enforced racial segregation through much of the southern United States. And we saw this in segregation of public schools, which the process of desegregation began in 1954 with Brown versus Ford, that important Supreme Court case. Public spaces like buses, which came into public attention in 1955 with Rosa Parks' demonstration, and then the following Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 to 1956. Water fountains, swimming pools, public restrooms, etc., were all bordered and ordered by these Jim Crow laws, these local and state laws enforcing segregation. And so just looking for these pictures on the slide here, one of these is showing you water fountains here. You notice they have water fountains here labeled white, and then water fountains here labeled colored, and it's meant to border and order people in the community on the basis of race. Also in Florence itself, there's a monument downtown to civil rights sit-ins. Sit-ins were a process of transgressing those borders and orders by refusing to give up your seat, right? Sitting in at a restaurant and refusing to get out. Peaceful forms of protest against racism in those spaces. But this is not just history, right? This is not just something that ended in the 1960s. Today, there are also unequal geographies of public investment which affect different communities differently, and especially along the lines of race. One thing we can mention, for example, is redlining and its legacies. Redlining was the process of forcing Black communities into segregated neighborhoods and then not investing in those neighborhoods due to perceived higher financial risk. So banks, for example, would refuse loans to African American buyers in these particular areas, thereby forcing them into other neighborhoods and creating spaces of public segregation. And then all the public spaces in those neighborhoods had reduced funding and low public investment because banks started to say, well, this neighborhood is a Black neighborhood. It's a higher risk of investment. We don't want to put money into those neighborhoods. And so these historical processes link up with contemporary processes of de facto segregation and de facto underfunding of public spaces on the basis of race that we still see in many urban areas today.
Keep moving on, yeah. In addition to the obvious ways that race has been bordered and ordered through American history and today, we also see this along lines of class. And there's an intersection between the relationship between racism and classism in the United States and how our public spaces and our community spaces have been designed. So here I give you two examples, the processes of gentrification as well as hostile architecture. In both of these cases, these processes are meant to create, quote, better spaces, better public spaces, better community spaces, but they have certain intended and unintended consequences that actually ends up making our communities less accessible for large groups of people. Gentrification, to start, is the process of trying to revitalize portions of communities that have lacked investment for a long time. This is particularly popular in those spaces that have been historically known as inner cities, and the places where there are lower socioeconomic status for the community. And again, it's no coincidence that there's an intersection of those lower socioeconomic communities with racial segregation in the United States. So the two images that I give you here are from New York City and the sites of what is known as the High Line Park. So the High Line, in the image on the left, was this area of kind of defunct tracks, railroad tracks, subway tracks that were no longer being used. And they do form a bit of an eyesore on the landscape, right? That meant property values and investment surrounding this High Line area were going to be pretty low, but that also made it affordable for local community members. On the right-hand side, you see what much of the High Line looks like today. Community members who did live along the High Line were sick of the eyesore, and they saw an opportunity to take over those borders and borders and make it a better space. Now it's quite beautiful. It's open and accessible for anyone to walk or gather or just enjoy the city. The unintended consequence of the High Line and of gentrification more broadly is that often when there's reinvestment in these neighborhoods, it leads to a significant skyrocketing of real estate prices around them. So all of a sudden, the community members that did live and thrive around these so-called eyesores are priced out. And again, this is not just about class, but often intersects with race, and particularly African American communities when we look at the nation more broadly. And that's what's happened in New York. On the right-hand side, I give you the example of hostile architecture. This movement is much more kind of forward about what it intends to do. It's a deliberate architectural strategy to try to remove the presence of homeless or transient populations from a public space. Homeless people and transient populations are often associated with bringing more crime or drug use to community areas, whether or not that's actually true, right? It's something that community developers and planners don't often want to see in their spaces. But rather than investing in better infrastructure and options for homeless people or transient populations to have resources and services, many communities have resorted to this method of hostile architecture. Let's redesign these spaces in a way that looks artistic, but also effectively erases homeless people from the landscape. No longer can homeless people sleep under a bridge if you lay it very strategically with these spikes and call them an art piece. Or if you design benches that are uncomfortable or angled in such a way that you couldn't lay down to take a nap. Bordering and ordering these spaces using processes of gentrification or hostile architecture inevitably make these spaces less accessible for certain groups in the community. And by recognizing that, then we can sort of transgress those borders and orders again and hopefully try to remake them. When it comes to hostile architecture, on one hand, we can say, well, we want our community to be safer. On the other hand, we must confront the idea that homeless and transient populations are a part of our citizenry, right? They deserve to be cared for and respected and have access to these spaces like anyone is supposed to. The other unintended consequence of hostile architecture, though, is that it just makes it less accessible for everyone. If you're elderly, pregnant, or differently abled, you are unable to access these urban public spaces in ways that you used to be able to. Good luck sitting down or getting up properly when you need a break. So hostile architecture and gentrification are these strategies to try to make spaces more welcoming, but they inevitably border and order people out of them. These spaces become less public, less accessible. As I said, race and class very much intersect when we look at these relationships between bordering and ordering public spaces in the United States. And we could also add gender to this concept. We've seen public spaces bordered and ordered. Historically, have been seen as exempt from the consideration of public space. In fact, women were considered to have their space in the home. Their concerns were domestic. And so public spaces were never really historically designed with women in mind. But as more women entered the public for work during and after the Industrial Revolution, ideas of how to make public spaces accessible to women, through quote, protecting women began to emerge. For example, the idea of gendered restrooms only emerged in the 1920s, and it ultimately used the same justification of separate but equal that had been established for racially segregated communities. And the idea was women need to have this separate space in order to be safe, to be protected from the dangers that the public space might provide to them. Today, this idea around gendered restrooms has become somewhat politicized again, but at its core, it's the same argument that somehow women are less safe in public spaces and adjustments need to be made for their safety. These ideas also permeate discussions of other kinds of public spaces like parks, parking lots, or even institutions like libraries after dark. Women are primed to be on alert in public spaces at specific times of the day and in specific areas, and in using them, women are seen as accepting some level of risk. Essentially, women are violating the geographic order that these spaces are not safe for them. So ideas around the protection of women and safety in public spaces have led to the adjustment of the infrastructure, like you see some examples here. Emergency call boxes, open walking paths where there aren't a lot of bushes or trees that would create kind of a barrier where you couldn't see what you were walking into, and frequent lighting spaces. These things do make spaces feel safer, right? And I think we can agree that they do make us feel more welcomed. So they're not in itself a bad thing. But in many cases, that safety is based around perceptions of safety that intersect with traditional ideas of not just gender, but also unfair assumptions about racial and class dynamics. Specifically, some places are constructed as unsafe simply because they exist within a lower socioeconomic community or a community that is historically Black or for other people of color. These kinds of things are quite dangerous, right? This assumption that some places are less safe just because they are inhabited by different groups of people. All of these then represent really good ways that race, class, and gender show this intersection between how public spaces have been bordered and ordered and how their level of accessibility has been challenged.
But even when access to public spaces is granted, those spaces oftentimes are ordered in such a way as to make their access in name only. And one of the processes that plays into this is the process of surveillance of public spaces. Virtual and physical public spaces are increasingly surveyed. In terms of the virtual, I'm sure we've all heard about, social media platforms and how they track your data and who you associate with and how you associate with stuff. And in terms of physical public spaces, we're constantly being surveyed in one way or another. I always tell my students that, on campus, when I first got here six years ago now, that they just put in these new video cameras, the university police, that were these high-tech video cameras that could see anything that you're doing in a public space on the university. It kind of freaked them out a little bit, this idea that this is supposed to be a public space that is increasingly surveyed. As Dr. Titanski-Hooper mentioned, this is often justified with the idea of safety. Does this make our public spaces more safe and secure? But is there a sense where the publicness of a public space relies on some sort of autonomy from the state or from other sorts of authorities in some way? What does it mean when you're organizing, for example, in a state park to protest the government, and yet you're being surveyed by video cameras, CCTV cameras like you see up here, or even just police presence in some of these areas? This picture on the bottom here is a picture of policing in Battery Park, New York City, and these cops are walking around in the park. You'll notice with helmets on and automatic weapons. And what happens in these spaces, not just in terms of how safe you feel in order to associate with other citizens, but also what kind of trust or distrust does it sow between the community and the people doing the policing? This picture here of the panopticon that we have in the corner here, Jeremy Bentham, a philosopher from the 18th century, made this remarkable idea about surveillance in prisons. And he said, you could have this big tower in the middle of this round circular prison like this, and you don't even have to put people in the tower. As long as people in the jail cells thought that they were being watched, they would be disciplined and behave in ways that are appropriate for the ordering mechanisms of that space. And in a lot of ways, the way that public spaces are surveyed today seem a lot like that panopticon, that idea that we're constantly, even if we're not being surveyed, that we might be, right? Or that we might be being watched. Should we have privacy in public? What kinds of autonomy should the public be given in relation to these authorities that may or may not be watching? Now I want to talk a little bit about the disappearance of public space. So we've talked a little bit about why it is that public space is important for democracy. We talked about some conceptual stuff about bordering and the ordering of spaces. And we've also talked about public space and the inequalities of access to space. I also want to talk about a broader phenomenon that is happening right now with public space, and that is its overall disappearance in general. Public space in America is shrinking, and along with it, those public things I mentioned before, podipane, that gather us up together. And part of this has to do with a political movement, a political idea called neoliberalism, which since the 1970s, there's really been a push in Western Europe and in the United States towards privatizing public goods and public spaces. If you remember back, I don't know if any of you remember back in 2008, one of the people running for president on the, I can't remember if he was running on an independent ticket or if he was running on a Republican ticket, but Ron Paul was running. And I remember during one of these debates, these primary debates, he made the argument that a lot of people rolled their eyes and ridiculed this idea of maybe we should privatize public utilities like the fire department. Why don't you just, instead of paying taxes that support the fire department, why don't you just make it a subscription service? You sign up for the fire department, and if there's a fire, then you're on the list, they'll come and put your house out. While we might say that that's ridiculous, that the fire department is a public service, it's something that's available to all citizens, It's really indicative of this general trend and desire in politics since the 70s to privatize as many of these public spaces as we can. Why? Maybe we can make money off of these spaces or make them self-sustaining, or maybe we can make them more efficient, right? This picture over here, this example, I think now from a couple of years ago, this person wrote this article in Forbes magazine arguing that maybe Amazon Books should replace local libraries to save taxpayer monies. Instead of taxpayers paying the library tax in their local communities, maybe Amazon Books should just replace that local service. It can make money, it can save taxpayers money, and be a private corporation effectively and efficiently dealing with these problems. Well, that's problematic for a couple of reasons. Because when public space begins to disappear, at least three things happen. Number one, it reduces our possibilities for acting together. Libraries do a whole lot more than just giving you access to books cheaply, right? Libraries are places where we act together, where we have citizen power. We put on programs at the library, we put on talks, we put on book clubs, we put on all sorts of these activities that draw communities and citizenries closer together. It can almost also limit access on the basis of race, gender, and class through privatization. Public spaces are oftentimes protected spaces of equality, whereas private spaces can really significantly limit who can access those spaces when and where. And finally, it puts power in private property holders and takes power away from public actors, right? We have much less of a choice about what these spaces look like when they become privatized. You know, if we were to make all of our local libraries Amazon-run profit centers, Amazon would have control over what those centers look like, not local communities, as we do with our libraries. And living in the age of COVID, I hate to say it like that we're living in an age of COVID, but it seems like we're now into the second year of this. How do things like the COVID-19 pandemic and these processes we've been talking about today help us rethink how we remake public space? First of all, how do we make creative, collective, and democratic spaces given all these problems that we've mentioned? Well, one is focusing on equality of access. When designing and conceptualizing public spaces, thinking, who are these spaces for? How do they operate and who do they exclude? How do we fix that? Secondly, addressing structural issues of race, gender, and class require a real attention to their spatial dimensions. You know, we're talking a lot in this country over the past half decade or so about race, gender, and class equality in new and revolutionary ways, but we can't fully address those issues unless we take the spatial dimensions of those issues into account and deal with issues like redlining, de facto segregation, deal with issues like gentrification and hostile architecture. And finally, we need to invest financially and emotionally in public things, including libraries and universities. You know, be expecting everybody to check on the way out for leaders. Universities, parks, public meeting spaces, these spaces of public goods that we as citizens are tasked with taking care of and being gathered out by. And COVID-19 puts us in a place where we're faced with all sorts of dilemmas, possibilities, and dangers when it comes to public space. Are we going to see the further privatization of public space in the context of COVID, or radical new possibilities? Well, on the one hand, COVID-19, as Dr. Titanski-Hooper mentioned at the beginning of our talk, limits the publicness of the public. You know, during all this, normally public events and public spaces have now been moved to online formats where people can participate still, but it's limited by digital formats and not face-to-face. You know, you'd have town hall meetings, for example, hosted over Zoom, rather than being in the public spaces that these take place in. Not to mention that Zoom is a privately owned company, right? Zoom is not a public space. Zoom is a space that is owned by a private entity. Opportunities for remote engagement and virtual spaces. Maybe virtual spaces will allow us to interact with members of our communities in ways we never imagined before, or allow access to spaces for people who normally could not access those spaces before. I know, for example, that we've got people joining us on Zoom right now for this talk, and that's a great example of how the virtual spaces might be allowing people who otherwise couldn't make it to this talk to attend and relate to people in your own community. And finally, maybe COVID-19 is also leading us to, that's my hope at least, to an emergence of appreciating material lived space. I think as things are beginning to open up, many of us are realizing, gosh, I love living in a place where there's so many parks, right? Or it's so nice to be able to go back to the library again, or whatever. My students wouldn't say that, I don't think, but I do. You know, it's the Florence County Library, beautiful space, great public space. It's great to be able to go back into those spaces now. Maybe COVID-19 will force us to realize that these spaces we normally take for granted are things that we really shouldn't take for granted, and that we should invest time and emotional energy into conserving.
So what we've tried to do here today is not only introduce the idea that public spaces are necessary to democracy and to community life, but also demonstrate how all public spaces are under threat due to the borders and orders that the structural inequalities in our society puts on them. There's so many more examples that are important to understanding how this works that we could have gone into today and wish we had the time to do so. But ultimately, we hope that this brought some things to your mind and helps us all to look at our own community a little bit differently. How are our public spaces bordered and ordered? In what ways have we gained or lost public space? And in what ways can we make them more inclusive and accessible? Thank you all so much for coming today and for giving us a chance to talk with you, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
So hopefully you can hear me. It seems like a lot of the ideas that she says public spaces should have, as far as around having equality and accessibility, are very important. But how do we ensure that those are part of public space and a part of their design if the people who are most impacted are typically not a part of the process making or decision making process for those spaces?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and it goes to part of the problems of thinking about democracy just in terms of elections, because elections are going to benefit the majority, right? That's what elections do, is they go toward the preferences of the median voter. But what happens when people being excluded from these spaces are people who have less of a voice in American politics? Well, it's tough, right? It's tough to make those kinds of changes, and they involve, number one, recognizing where these problems are and really pushing your community leaders on them. But on the other hand, recognizing that political action itself is often limited and bordered by democratic spaces, or by these kinds of spaces that we're talking about here. I mean, one great example of this, I think, are suburbs, right? Is that suburbs are, in a lot of ways, similar to hostile architecture in the sense that they're meant not to be walkable. They're meant to be spaces that are set apart from inner city areas and be separated out. It makes it really hard to access those spaces if you are not part of that space. Well, how do you change that if you are not allowed access to that space and therefore can't vote for the congressional representative in that area, or something like that, right? It does make those things very hard. What we hope to do, at least as the kind of political part of this, is just bring awareness to the fact that these spaces are unequal, and that start lighting fires under our leaders to change things and make these spaces more equal.
Thanks. I would add to that while voting isn't the only mechanism for democracy, it is important. And in the United States, we tend to view national elections as being the most important, when really, if we want to change our community spaces and make them more accessible, it's those local elections that are really important, right? So the mobilization that we saw in the last kind of larger Florence election, and the ability to elect an African-American woman as the mayor, right? With the hopes that then she's going to be able to vocalize some of the concerns of people who've been less heard, and then kind of alter the landscape in a way that makes that hopefully more inclusive, right, in the long term. That's the ultimate goal, right? So the kind of shifting needs to happen from all of these different sides, like yes, public protests, but also mobilizing those kind of traditional forms of voting, especially on the local level. And giving people more of a voice, which we critiqued a lot of virtual spaces today, but it is cost prohibitive or for transportation issues to make it to community meetings. But when you can log in Zoom, does that mean you're going to be able to do that and maybe actually get a chance to speak? Because seeing that in the virtual space kind of indicates that hand raise, right? So I think it's a multiple pronged approach, and it's easy because all the things we talked about today, I mean, this is woven into our history, right? And not just in the United States, but in every other context that we could talk about. So you're not just fixing one space today, you're tackling these issues that are so embedded in the longer histories and kind of struggles, and it's overwhelming, but not impossible.
Oh, and to add on to that as well, what Dr. Titanski-Hooper is talking about here are questions about descriptive representation, and that is so important, is that the people that represent us should look like our communities, right? The idea being that those people will be best able to speak to the issues of those communities. And an example I always think about, because it's such a disturbing example, is Ferguson, Missouri in 2015 with the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter protests, and really questions about public space and fundamental questions like, can African-American people living in the United States actually live, survive, and thrive in public spaces, or are they going to face things like police brutality? And what was shocking about that whole situation is that Ferguson, being a suburb of St. Louis, its city council was an entirely white city council in a 75% Black suburb of St. Louis. Remarkable there, the lack of descriptive representation. What happens when your representatives don't look like your community? Well, maybe they're not going to take the community's interests into consideration in the way that they should. And so that's something important to think about.
Yes, please. Moving to the issue of gentrification, are you aware of any measures being taken to fight against it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I should say that gentrification is not something that people wholesale are against or for, right? There is this recognition that this is a problematic process. And in some cities, like for example, Cincinnati, I have this weird knowledge of Ohio places, even though I'm not from there. Cincinnati made the decision to freeze some rents in their neighborhood that's called Over the Rhine because they were revitalizing that through gentrification. And they also recognized that that's primarily where their African-American community resided in the city, and they didn't want to see them pushed out. So it wasn't perfect because you still got some of those aspects of gentrification, like frankly, businesses for wealthy white people, right? But by freezing the rents, the idea was, can we still keep the community here and still create spaces for them to have their businesses, have their community gathering spaces? We can also think about that in relation to the downtown revitalization in Florence. And this is something I know less about. I've only been here a few years, but to my initial geographer's eye, I thought, oh, this is textbook gentrification, right? But when I talk to my African-American students, they do see things like, but also we've been able to maintain some of our barbershops, or also we can use this space and it's better now. So it's not a, we're for or against this issue, but in what ways can we get the community involved in how should gentrification look? Because yeah, the Highland's beautiful. We want our communities to look better. We just don't want to have to push everybody out to get it.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. And I think that Dr. Titanski-Hooper's point here about rent control is something that a lot of different municipalities around the country are working with. I mean, when I lived in Alexandria, Virginia, we had rent control, and the idea was to keep populations that are living there now from being pushed out when gentrification makes the market rent go up here. But there's huge debates about this and pushback against rent control as well. You hear people say, well, what's that going to lead to? Apartments that aren't well kept up, right? Because the landlord's not going to care about an apartment that they're selling for under market rate and all this stuff. But so these are kinds of issues that these rent control programs that are going on around the country are trying to deal with. I know there's one in Minnesota that they voted on just recently. I can't remember what the outcome was, but it was very controversial because it was going to be just a 3% rent increase every year was allowed and no exceptions on new constructions. And so that was very controversial because it would be hard on landlords to make money on all that kind of stuff. But then the question is, who are we supposed to be? Who's the state supposed to be protecting here, right? The wealthy landlords or citizens who have maybe lived in these neighborhoods for decades? Yeah. What was that?
Don't be a landlord then.
Yeah, I mean,
Go into a different business.
yeah, it's like, if life is so hard, maybe you can work a minimum wage job at Chick-fil-A.
That's right.
But yeah, I mean, those are very controversial situations, but a lot of municipalities around the country have been trying to come up with ways to save people money on rent. Like I said, when I lived in Alexandria, I rented an apartment for $800. It was already, well, as a graduate student, I was like, oh, that's a lot of money. But the next year, market rent went up so much that even though I had rent control because I lived there for a year, people were renting the same apartment I had next door to me for $1,200, $1,300 more. It's rent control isn't going to, it's going to maybe help stem the tide of people flowing out of communities, but it's certainly not going to solve the problem of how you keep people or bring into these communities other than upper middle class white people.
We clearly keep talking about this, because something else just popped in my mind. I was thinking about how the city of Florence has tried to really up their game with their social media campaigns and how they were highlighting Black-owned businesses in the downtown area. And that's also really important because this kind of gives a more publicity to those businesses, and it makes the rest of the community aware of the importance of Black-owned businesses. And so it's, you know, again, it's this kind of multi-pronged approach of, yes, protest and voting and all of this, but even just reframing the discussion, making us aware of where these things are, right? For people who don't already know, raising the profile, protecting them through things like rent control, but also protecting them in the sense of showing their value, right? They have so much value in the community. And so we don't want them to be erased in that way. Any other questions?
Wow, that was a lot of information. Dr. Titanski, Dr. Tatum, a lot of food for thought. And we thank you so, so, so much. I think it was a great presentation. Let's give them another. We thank the live streamers and we thank you all for coming out, and that concludes our conversation.
So there's like 5 or 6 people.